Cool. Sent to a third party. That's ominous. Dun dun dun. Dun 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 dun
Where
dun
did it
dun.
say
Dun.
that? Oh, sent to YouTube now.
Yeah.
Okay. You ready at any point? Matt? Or sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I'm just posting the thing because I suck. Okay. That should do it. Alrighty, folks. Tonight we're going to talk about section one of Hegel's uh, philosophy of nature. We are working out of the Oxford copy, which is this fun volume. You might remember this ugly looking cover from its um, sort of yellowish, off yellowish version from the Phenomenology of Spirit. The others kind of look the same except with different colors. And in here, Hegel works on delineating the necessity of um, what nature turns out to be from the absolute idea. If you have no idea what that means, well, stay tuned. So, after going through the introduction and trying to get a handle on how Hegel plans to deal with nature, he starts out with the most abstract uh, elements of nature, which are the mechanics, which has to do with categories that we're all, I think, familiar with: space and time, um, and what motion is, what matter is, and sort of, how one looks at it from the point of view of necessity. Now, this is going to be backwards, okay? It was very well, it's not easy, but it's easier with categories of thought to just say, well, okay, we'll go in that order. Why not? But here it becomes very clear as Hegel deals with actual science vocabulary that I think most of us are familiar with, at least from high school, if not later. We're dealing with physics, we're dealing with mechanics, and but the way that he derives it is not from empirical objects. Hegel knows that these objects of nature from matter to motion and bodies, in motion, the earth around the sun, the whole thing. He knows that they all exist, but his aim is to give definition and determination to those categories that populate those things that we take for granted. His main goal is to show the necessity of that nature, necessity and contingency, as it turns out, that nature displays from the ground up. So he says, and I'll just read this out on the first page. He says, self-externality splits at once into two forms, positively as space and negatively as time. And that, and this, I think, is the summary of most of how this works. The first concrete thing, the unity and negation of these abstract moments, is matter. This is related to its moments, space and time, And these consequently are themselves related to each other, i.e., in motion. When this relation is not external, we have the absolute unity of matter and motion, self-moving matter. So, there in a nutshell is the summary. Most of it's not going to make much sense, but we'll start out with space on subsection 254. Kyle, if you could read out just 254.
First or immediate determination of nature is space, the abstract universality of nature's self-externality. Self-externality, mediationless indifference. It is a wholly ideal side by sideness because it is self-externality, and it is absolutely continuous because thus this ascenderness is still quite abstract and contains no specific difference within itself.
Yeah.
Like,
So, um, yeah, he starts out with space. And as we go through here, you're going to find a lot, if you're familiar with the logic, that bears a resemblance to being and nothing and becoming. And this is not this is not a coincidence. The logical shapes of these very, very abstract concepts of nature mirror that of thought and being in general. And I think this helps to solidify, at least for me, Spinoza's observation that the order of things and the order of thought are exactly the same. So, um, let's see here. All right, hang on just a second. I was thinking of making this a lecture, but some of this is on the fly, and so um,
yeah,
Poolgate does a lot better um, at turning it into a lecture. And I guess I could just sit here and read off of his book because he pretty much gives it blow for blow. Uh, but the explanations are actually they're not long. They're just um, as detailed as he can be.
I think at this point, like it just starts out basically with an indeterminate number of dimensions because it's just sort of there as externality.
Yeah, and not only externality, but continuous externality.
Mhm.
Um, like it just keeps going. Space. It keeps going. And right now you're thinking, okay, well this is like outer space, the vacuum. Actually, no, I wouldn't say that this did I think it applies to the determination of space in between the objects, but we haven't even gotten to the objects that exist in space. And so space is much more abstract than even the mass-filled one that we're used to dealing with the space shuttle, exists around the moon, Mars, us, the sun, and whatnot. And he talks here. He says space is simply pure quantity, only no longer as a logical determination, but as existing immediately and externally. So basically, in reality, nature consequently does not begin with the qualitative, but with the quantitative, because its determination is not like being in logic, the abstractly first and immediate, but a being already essentially mediated within itself, an external and other being. Okay. This is connecting back to what the absolute idea is and what its truth is in nature. Okay. So at this level, what we talk about when we talk about matter, just to start with, right? Or like a rock in space, right? How do we talk about how the thing is in space and it endures in time, right? How is it moving exactly, and how can you qualify what movement is in the first place. Okay. All of those things are abstract concepts that in themselves have to be identified before you can even apply it to the matter. Because if you go in reverse and you find a rock in space and you start affixing to it all of these propositions, these, what's the word? Attributes. Yeah. You're taking for granted that those attributes apply just from your observation. But are you using the right attributes? Do those attributes make necessary the rock that's in space? That's a hard question to ask, or that's a hard question to answer. And I think Hegel, with his method, uh, answers them quite nicely by being giving you the tools to define what those things are without reference to the rock. With before you get to matter, you have to go through the categories that matter has attributes of. Okay. So let's see here. So yeah. So I'm going to read a little bit of this off because Hoolgate gives some good insights here. He says, "Space, we will recall, is self-determining reason existing in the form of externality. Space is thus not sheer externality or self-externality alone, but the field of externality is itself concept, totality, idea. As a consequence, Hegel points out spatial externality must contain within itself the differences of the concept or the idea. The precise form that such differences will take in space cannot be predicted in advance, but must emerge imminently from the minimal character of spatial difference as such. All we know at the start is that, as the embodiment of reason, space must minimally exist to determine it qualitative difference." Okay. And what it turns out this difference within space is the three dimensions. And the three dimensions he maps out in the book. Let's see here. Yeah, 255. He says, "Space as in itself, the notion as such, contains within itself the differences of the notion. In the indifference of space, these are immediately the three dimensions which are merely diverse and possess no determination whatever." Okay. So here you might be thinking on a grander scale, what are the dimensions of the universe in general, like the actual empirical universe and what it's doing, etc. What Hegel is doing here is delineating what the dimensions of space are in the first place. Like, you know what I mean? Like externally, what kind of space is it? Well, he already knows that it's a three-dimensional space, but he can't just say that because that's putting what already exists in the place of the proof, which is basically it's what he calls starting with the absolute and working down. He goes the other way. He starts with the abstract and goes up to the absolute. So let's see here. Geometry is not required to deduce that space necessarily has just three dimensions, because it is not a philosophical science. It may presuppose as its subject matter space with its universal dimensions. But apart from this, no thought is given to the necessity of such a deduction. He's basically saying the same thing I just did, only, better. The necessity is based on the nature of the notion, whose determinations in this first form of asunderness is in abstract quantity are altogether superficial and a completely empty difference. The reason, therefore, why it cannot be said how height, length, and breadth differ from each other is that these three dimensions only ought to be different, but that they are not yet differences. It is not at all fixed whether a direction is called height, length, or breadth. The more precise definition of height is to be in the direction of the center of the earth. But this more concrete determination does not concern the nature of space in itself, right? We're not talking about relation to a body like the Earth or rock in space or anywhere here, right? We're just talking about space itself. Um, so let's see here. So he maps this out and he says the difference of space is, however, essentially a determinate qualitative difference. As such, it is first the negation of space itself, because this is immediate differenceless self-externality, a point. But the negation is the negation of space. It is itself spatial. The point is essentially this relation, that is, as sublating itself is the line, the first other being, right? Spatial being of the point. So the point has gained extension, right? The truth of other being, the line, is, however, negation of the negation. The line consequently passes over into the plane. So if you think of a point, makes a line. You take the line and you move it along a two-dimensional plane that doesn't exist, right? You know, in the substrate, the abstract substrate we call space, of course, the line becomes a plane. Basically, the line stretches itself and relates itself to itself, and it becomes an enclosing surface, is what he calls it. The line consequently passes over into the plane, which on the one hand is a determinateness opposed to line and point, and so surface simply as such, but on the other is the sublated negation of space. It is thus the restoration of the spatial totality, which now contains the negative moment within itself, an enclosing surface which separates off a single whole space. So he's defining what space is externally. At first, it appears at the very beginning as what's the word? Um, Space, other than being an abstraction and immediate externality, is also um, I'm not saying the word. Sorry. Continuous. Keeps going on forever. It's absolutely continuous, right? At first. And now we have and now we're looking at how this is what it's made up of. Um, Basically, it's shape in and of itself. Um, the remark is rather is well, I mean, I would say the remark in the Zusatz is rather long, um, but he goes into some geometrical comments. Jump in anytime, Kyle, if
Yeah.
or Jim, if you've got the
Mm,
Well, it
I
doesn't
think
go
it's fine.
beyond 3 dimensions, but
Yeah, you
that
can't.
that but a little bit
no,
later than Hegel, mathematicians did start talking about n-dimensional spaces,
Right.
which is
right.
not Hegel does not address here because I don't think
I think
mathematicians were talking about that yet.
I think, and of course, I think Colgate says toward the end is that it's not necessary that Hegel proves that three dimensions are absolute, like the absolute. It's more like it's the minimum required to have a self-referential, self-all-enclosing version of space. You can't define it with 2 dimensions or lower.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it follows logically. In other words, and I get the feeling that if we could perceive the other spatial dimensions, if there are ones above three, then it would be very easy to fold that observation into the logical proof. And all you'd really have to do is delineate it out and then say what it looks like, right? Because that's really all Hegel is doing, right? You got the point, you got the line, you got the plane, and then you've got the the geometrical object. Like say you take the plane and you move it up into the third dimension, and what do you have? You have a cube, right? With him, with how generally he deals with the lines, like the lines could be curved, the plane could be irregular, it could be any geometrical object, which is how he deals with the three-dimensional object. And I was trying to find it. Um, he I really like how he makes reference to not only Pythagoras but also Euclid. And so to talk about some of these things, he makes reference and talks it out, but I think he also refers the reader to these because you know, I mean, it's good to read those and be familiar with them and how they work, because they give you a good guide to how this stuff looks. Sorry. Um, I don't know why I highlighted this, but I'll just read it out. The truth of the matter is this, that the proposition only requires one triangle, which is in itself such a relationship that when its first three parts are determined, the remaining three parts also are. The triangle is determined by two sides and one angle. So basically, he's isolating what is necessary to define a shape and what's not, you know. This is achieved in Pythagoras' theorem. Here we have the complete determinateness of the triangle, since only the right angle is completely determined, its supplementary angle being equal to it. This proposition is consequently superior to all others as a symbol concept of the idea. It represents a whole, self-divided into its parts, just as each form in philosophy is self-divided into notion and reality. This quote above anything else I've read so far is proof to me that Hegel's critique of Spinoza in the logic about his method of using the geometrical demonstration as he does, Spinoza does in his ethics, is bunk. He knows perfectly well that the geometrical presentation, if done correctly, can show you what the concept is properly for looking at any object. Okay. If you do it right, it will apply and it will be well applied, I think. What Hegel brings to the table, I think, beyond that is the ability to be able to hook all of these parts together in their necessity from abstract to concrete so that you have a whole that's continuous and immanent. And, and that's kind of what Hegel brings to the table. I cannot tell you if Spinoza does any of that yet. I'll get back to you. But just this description right here, I think really represents you know, uh, a very Spinozan way of looking at the whole and the parts. Um, um, so he talks about the circle. He talks about Euclid's book. The relationship of these three is the determinateness of the circle, not simple as in the first definition, but a relation of differentiated elements. There's a quote for all your books. A relation of differentiated elements. That's that right there is I think very important for understanding the whole and the parts as well as dialectic theory. And with Pythagoras's theorem, Euclid also closes his first book. Okay, so hang on just a second, because I don't want to close out space without at least touching on the three-dimensional object. Okay, so So here's a question. Uh, does Hegel's dialectical logic make it necessary that space be differentiated into an endless infinity of dimensions? No, it does not. Because the third negation that logically generates the three-dimensional geometrical body is not simply a repetition of the second negation that defines the plane, and so it does not automatically call forth a further negation. Three-dimensional space, and this is skipping down, is thus logically all there is to space. It is space as totality. Logically, space must be one, the simple negation of itself, that is, the non-dimensional point and one-dimensional line that do no more than interrupt the continuity of space. That's one. Always comes in threes. Two, the explicit negation of that simple negation, i.e., or that is the two-dimensional plane that does not just interrupt space but constitutes bounded affirmative space. This is the plane. Okay. And three, the sublation of negation altogether, i.e., or that is the three-dimensional geometrical body that is no longer primarily negative but truly affirmative. Beyond these three negations and their corresponding dimensions, there's nothing logically that space is required to be. Let's see. Hegel asserts that geometry, and we read this section, by which he means Euclid, cannot prove that space must have three dimensions, but simply has to assume this to be the case from experience, basically, and the senses. He believes, however, that philosophy can provide Hegel such a proof by demonstrating a priori that space must differentiate itself through negation and self-negation into points, lines, planes, and geometrical bodies. Several things need to be noted about Hegel's philosophical account of space. First, Hegel is not trying to prove the independent physical existence of geometrical figures. He's arguing that the fabric of space itself is necessarily geometrical in structure and for this reason must be three-dimensional. Second, Hegel argues that space must differentiate itself into lines, planes, and total bodies, all of which introduce ideal boundaries into the continuity of space, but he does not deny that space continues beyond any ideal boundaries that it may contain. First and foremost, in its immediate abstract form, space is continuous, goes on and on. This does not change after you've sort of defined what space actually consists of in the abstract over, in its structure over and above its continuousness. So there's that. Space is unbounded, is what he's saying. Third, the geometrical figures into which space differentiates itself are generated in a logical sequence, one from the other. This does not mean, however, that lines consist of points or that planes consist of lines. Reading the geometrical textbook, that is exactly like Euclid. That's exactly what I, as the layman, imagined it doing, right? And, there were animations, old school computer animations that showed the point turning into a line, turning into a plane, turning into a geometrical cube, so on and so forth. Let's see here. Hegel's argument, rather, and pay attention to this, is that lines are what points prove in truth to be, and that planes are lines that are explicitly self-relating. Indeed, once space has shown itself to be three-dimensional, it becomes apparent that geometrical points, lines, and planes are in fact simply abstractions from the totality of space which already exists. You understand? Okay? Yeah. We're dealing with objects that already exist all throughout Hegel's system, but the way that he proves them in their necessity makes it look like the abstract concepts generate the later ones. This is not the case. Rather, we're proving that what already exists consists of the categories that we use to talk about it, but it's proven logically so that there's a line of necessity running through all of them like a thread, right? You can't pull that thread out without reality just collapsing. Okay. Let's see here. Abstractions from the totality of space rather than space's fundamental constituents, right? All physical points, lines, and planes drawn, for example, on paper will, of course, be three-dimensional, and they couldn't be anything else if you wanted them to represent space properly, if that makes sense. Fourth, Hegel's philosophical demonstration that space must have three dimensions obviously accords well with our ordinary experience. It does not, however, accord with all sides of modern scientific thinking about space. The proponents of string theory, for example, argue that for string theory to make sense, the universe should have 9 space dimensions and 1 time dimension, for a total of 10. Does that mean that Hegel's philosophy of nature is incompatible with string theory? Not necessarily. For whatever Hegel himself may have thought, he does not prove definitively that space tout court can only have 3 dimensions. All he proves is that space must be three-dimensional to the extent that it is determined by its own inherent logic, and so is rational. This certainly rules out the possibility of purely two-dimensional space, but it leaves open the possibility that, as a matter of contingent fact, space might have more than the 3 dimensions its inherent logic requires it to have. Now, you're thinking to yourself, what do I mean by contingent fact? Basically, I mean stuff that we don't know yet, but later we may come to know. And when we come to know that, it will no longer be a contingent fact. It'll be a necessary fact. And it can be strung on that string that holds together the necessity of how all of the parts hang together into a whole. So, yeah, and then he says it's beyond my competence to assess the plausibility of string theory. It seems to me, however, that if space were indeed to be shown to have 9 dimensions, this would not automatically leave Hegel's philosophy of nature dead in the water. In that case, the Hegelian could argue that only 3 dimensions can be derived logically from the very nature of space, and that no philosophical explanation can be given for any dimension space is found to have beyond the 3 with which we are familiar. I would go beyond that, honestly, because our experience gives us a knowledge of the 3 dimensions and how they work. If we found, you put on VR glasses and you can see the 4th and 5th spatial dimension and so forth, all the way up to 9, you know, then you could fill in the gaps, is what I'm saying. How you would do that and what they would consist of,
I
mean,
mean,
your
yes,
guess is as good as mine.
there's a lot of the theory about how the other spatial dimensions work is they're kind of very much wrapped around themselves. So in that
Yeah.
way, the 3 spatial dimensions we are familiar with are the only ones with the quality of extension. And I kind of thought it interesting is that the minimum determination of space is 3. And one of the things that nature does like to do is to use the least energy possible. So in that way, that can be an explanation potentially of why we now have 3 dimensions of externality, because that's the minimum.
Well, that's the thing, because our senses give us it's kind of funny because our senses, if you really look at your computer screen or around you, you're actually seeing a flat panel that is the world. And then you start moving around in it and you realize the flat panel is actually this changing perspective that shows you the 3rd dimension. So when you are in motion, the appearance of a 2-dimensional show changes into a 3-dimensional experience, right? There's nothing to say if there are further dimensions into which we extend as human beings that they aren't there necessarily, but our senses can't take them in unaided if they're there. That is a completely contingent
Mhm.
hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, a speculation, if you will, right? There could be further dimensions from which I don't know. I it's like you said, Kyle. Uh, Space time curves. If it curved off into the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth dimension, I mean, uh, that would be wild.
Well, it
So
does
yeah.
now just tangentially before we move on to kind of remind me of something. Uh, when the quote's like matter tells space how to curve and space tells matter how to move. Like it's of course you not space is space time. That's a dialectical definition that science likes to use all the time. Just just a
Well,
point out.
now, we have about 15 minutes. We might go over.
Mhm.
Um, I'm so, Jim, if you could read time 257. Negative.
Negativity as point relates itself to space in which it develops its determinations as line and plane, but in the sphere of self-externality, negativity is equally for itself, and so are its determinations. But at the same time, these are posited in the sphere of self-externality, and negativity in so doing appears as indifferent to the inert side-by-sideness of space. Negativity thus posited for itself is time.
Thanks. So, um, in pictorial thought, and he says this at the bottom in the Zats. In pictorial thought, space and time are taken to be quite separate. We have space and also time. Philosophy fights against this also. They are in unity as well as in their difference. And trying to find where Huelge talks about this. Um, so yeah, the three dimensions of space are generated by the fact that space is necessarily the negation of its own uninterrupted continuity, and thus divided into points and lines. It has a structure while continuing to be continuous, uninterrupted, continuous. So both. But also the negation of that very negation, and thus planar and total or three dimensional. Space differentiates itself into three dimensions, therefore, by logically negating itself. In Hegel's own words, negativity constitutes the dimensions of space. Yet, in giving itself three dimensions, space negates itself in a relatively mild way, for in so doing, it preserves its character as space. It is still that continuous space. Okay? Hegel points out, however, that this renders space deeply contradictory. Since each spatial dimension is a negation of space, or negation of that negation, the negations that space introduce into itself actually take a positive form, the three dimensions, right? And subsist as real directions in space. As Hegel puts it, in space, all negativity appears as something that is, or that is. For this reason, he maintains the negative in space does not yet receive its due, but is paralyzed or lamed, and so falls apart into indifferent subsistence. This, however, cannot be the whole story, for space is self negating and so logically must negate its very spatiality as such, right? So far, the negations that have defined space actually, in their totality, exist positively. So again, you have continuous space as well as the structure of space, all positively defined logically. And so we're left with, okay, where's the negation? Where's the negation of being that turns being into nothing, so to speak? Um, that is, space must negate itself in a manner that does not just leave it subsisting as self-external being, but that causes it to actually disappear into nothingness. In this way, space will prove to be genuinely negative. Since space qua space does not negate itself in this way, however, it must mutate logically into a new form of being that is no longer simply spatial but is thoroughly self-negating. Such being, Hegel maintains, is time. Time is thus not something independent of space, but simply what space itself logically proves to be, space that has become explicitly what it was implicitly. Space necessarily temporalizes itself through its own immanent logic. Since it is self-negating, it cannot remain primarily affirmative being or indifferent subsistence, but must negate itself into being that is truly self-negating. According to Hegel, space is thus the pure negativity of itself, or the transition into time. Ordinary consciousness, Hegel claims, tends to separate space and time from one another. We have space and also time, which we just read. Philosophy, by contrast, Hegel says, fights against this also and understands time to be nothing but the passing away of space itself. Space for Hegel is the very least that nature can be, and time is the process of self-negation or vanishing that space itself proves to be. Time is thus nothing but the negative in nature, or nature as sheer negativity. Indeed, it is negative and self-negating to such a degree that it does not even it is not even just the vanishing of being, but is equally the emergence or coming to be of the very being that vanishes. Okay. Since it is just as much the emerging as the vanishing of being, time is necessarily continuous and unending. So at the beginning, we have space, and space is continuous. Time, it turns out, is also continuous and unending, given its logical structure. For readers of the logic, you will find here a really cool parallel. Not just parallel, but structurally the same, because what I just described was the coming to be and the passing away, that becoming as an abstract category in the logic is shown to be. And yeah, time thus has an even more contradictory structure than space, for it is neither purely affirmative being nor nothing at all, but being that passes over into nothing, just as it arises out of nothing. In Hegel's own words, time is being which, inasmuch as it is not, and inasmuch as it is being which, inasmuch as it is not, and is inasmuch as it is not, is. So it's going both ways at the same time. As the continuous vanishing of being, time differentiates itself into three dimensions: past, present, and future. Each dimension is made necessary by the contradictory logical structure of time itself. And I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. Kyle, go ahead and read 258.
Time as a negative unity of self-externality, similarly an out-and-out abstract ideal being. It is that being which, inasmuch as it is not, inasmuch as it's not, is. It is becoming directly intuited. That means that differences which admittedly are purely momentary, in this example, directly self-sublating, are determined as external, in this example, as external to themselves.
Yep. And he says time, like space, is a pure form of sense or intuition, the non-sensuous sensuousness. Isn't that great? But as in the case of space, the distinction of objectivity and a subjective consciousness confronting it does not apply to time. Uh, time is the principle as the same principle as the I equals I of pure self-consciousness. But this principle, or the simple notion, it's still in its uttermost externality and abstraction, as intuited mere becoming, pure being with itself as sheer coming out of itself. Time is continuous too, like space, for it is the negativity abstractly relating self to self, and in this abstraction, there is as yet no real difference. Yeah. Everything, yeah. Everything it is said comes to be and passes away in time. If abstraction is made from everything, namely from what fills time, and also from what fills space, then what we have left over is empty time and empty space. In other words, these abstractions of externality are posited and represented as if they were for themselves. But it is not in time that everything comes to be and passes away. Rather, time itself is the becoming, this coming to be and passing away, the actually existent abstraction, Chronos, from whom everything is born and by whom its offspring is destroyed. This is kind of what I was talking about when I said that when you're talking about how a human being, you know, I live 90 years, say, right? And we always talk about me coming to be and passing away in time. This is Hegel showing you that time and its structure and how it works is independent of any of the objects that it applies to. Okay. He's showing you how, in order to get a proof of necessity of how these things are strung together logically, they're going to look upside down. And yes, that is a Marx reference a little bit, but also Hegel. He talks about how the way this looks tends to look upside down to the layman, because the layman takes the world in with sense experience and sees the finished product already in front of him or her or them, right? The way Hegel does it is while knowing that all of this exists, again, um, he wants to he wants to clarify concepts to do good science, so that when you use these concepts, these notions, you can use them in such a way that they're logical, that they don't leave anything for granted in your argument. Because if you leave even one of these tabs on the string, sort of hanging out there, taking it for granted that it exists and it's doing whatever job you think it is doing, you're leaving yourself open to criticism, first of all, but you're also not fully explaining reality on whatever subject you're talking about.
Well, a lot of this discussion came up in Soviet debates over the theory of relativity, because in the 20s and 30s there was strong resistance against the theory of relativity. I think primarily because Einstein drew upon Ernst Mach. Mach was, of course, criticized by Lenin, in his book Materialism and Theory of Criticism. And over time, what happened was, in Soviet philosophers and physicists, basically they were drawing upon Frederick Engels. They were citing Engels, but Engels was basically just repeating what Hegel had said here.
Yeah,
And they were able to show that a lot of concepts in relativity could made perfect sense from a Hegelian Engels standpoint.
yeah,
Yes, and so that's how they defended relativity.
yeah.
There was a whole literature in Soviet literature on this,
Nice.
which I read, some of it.
I'd like to read that too. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
What it really boils down to is organizing the information so that, you're not just sort of taking the opening arguments for granted, but
Yeah.
grounding them properly, I guess you could say. Hegel goes on here a little bit, and I think it's actually helpful to read through some of it. He says the real is certainly distinct from time, but it is also essentially identical with it. What is real is limited, and the other to this negation is outside it. Therefore, the determinateness in it is self-external, and is consequently the contradiction of its being. The abstraction of this externality and unrest of its contradiction is time itself. The finite is perishable and temporal because, unlike the notion, it is not in its own self total negativity. True, this negativity is immanent in it as its universal essence, but the finite is not adequate to this essence. It is one sided, and consequently, it is related to negativity as to the power that dominates it. The notion, however, in its freely self existent identity as I equals I, is in and for itself absolute negativity and freedom. Time, therefore, has no power over the notion, nor is the notion in time or temporal. On the contrary, it is the power over time, which is this negativity only qua externality. Only the natural, therefore, is subject to time insofar as it is finite. And that's a big sentence right there that you should note. Only the natural, therefore, is subject to time insofar as it is finite. The true, on the other hand, the idea, spirit, is eternal. So yeah, he's getting to the difference between the finite and the infinite. The the natural versus I think Holgate talks a little in here as well. Um, yeah. Yeah, I mean he's basically just getting into reality that is eternity. Um, that's sort of the substrate in which all of us finite beings uh, exist is eternal. It's ongoing. We've already established that space and time are continuous and uh, and ongoing. So he goes into he goes into some of this in uh, what does he say here? Time is not, as it were, a receptacle into which everything is placed as in a flowing stream, which sweeps it away and engulfs it. Time is only this abstraction of destruction. It is because things are finite that they are in time. It is not because they are in time that they perish. On the contrary, things themselves are the temporal, and to be so is their objective determination. It is therefore the process of actual things themselves which makes time, and through time is called, and though time is called omnipotent, it is also completely impotent. And this part, I love this. The now has a tremendous right. It is nothing as the individual now, for as I pronounce it, this proudly exclusive now dissolves, flows away, and falls into dust. Duration, all of those nows strung together, is the universal of all these nows. It is the sublatedness of this process of things which do not endure. And though things endure, time still passes away and does not rest. In this way, time appears to be independent of and distinct from things. But if we say that time passes away, even though things endure, like mountains, over a short period of time, right? This merely means that although some things endure, change is nevertheless apparent in others, as for example, in the course of the sun, and so after all, things are in time. You ever looked at one of those geological maps that shows you where the volcanic craters are in, say, Washington State, the Northwest, and how the different like calderas have moved around over the last 10 to 20 thousands of years? It's amazing to look at because you see all this stuff moving around. But from our point of view, our short time on this earth, without those geological studies, we wouldn't have known that like Mount St. Helens wasn't there where it is today. It was over here, or maybe not even there before it, showed up. And so duration is harder to grasp in the longue durée, I think, and that's why it's the universal of all of those nows. Um, yeah, subject to change, their duration is thus only relative. Um, the difference, therefore, between eternity and duration is that the latter is only a relative sublating of time, whereas eternity is infinite. That is not relative duration, but duration reflected into itself. This is one thing I like about the philosophy of nature is that when you're looking at some of these objects like duration, and he says that duration reflected into itself is eternity. It gives you a better definition, more concrete definition of what reflected into self meant than than when it appeared in the science of logic. Because in the science of logic, when you're talking about what's a good example, Kyle? What what was reflected into itself?
Ground.
Any category
I'm looking at
from the logic.
contradiction, identity, and difference. That's the area for
Yeah,
it.
yeah. It's harder to get a beat on what some of these terms mean, but when you apply it to something as concrete as, say, a duration, and a duration turns into the infinite, meaning it's reflected into itself, it gets you, it gives you a better picture. Um, anyway, he goes down here and oh I love this. He rounds it out. I know we're going over time, but I think we should at least finish off time at least, because this is just beautiful. So he says, on its phenomenal side, law enters into the time process, uh, in that the moments of the notion have a show of self-subsistence, but in their notion, the excluded differences are reconciled and coexist in peace again. The idea, spirit, transcends time because it is itself the notion of time. It is eternal in and for itself and is not dragged into the time process because it does not lose itself in one side of the process. In the individual as such, it is otherwise, for on one side it is the genus. The most beautiful life is that in which the universal and its individuality are completely united in a single form. But the individual is then also separated from the universal, and as such, it is only one side of the process and is subject to change. It is in respect of this moment of mortality that it falls into time. Achilles, the flower of Greek life, Alexander the Great, that infinitely powerful individuality, do not survive. Only their deeds, their effects remain. That is, the world which they brought into being. Mediocrity endures, Trump, and in the end rules the world. That's great. There is also a mediocrity of thought which beats down the contemporary world, extinguishes spiritual vitality, converts it into mere habit, and in this way endures. And if you think about our past conversations about what logic had sort of mutated itself into in the scholastic period as sort of accounting for everything that's mundane, I think this is kind of what he means. When you lose sight of what spirit, the side of spirit that endures, all you're left with is the mediocrity. You know what I mean? Um, And he says its endurance is simply this, that it exists in untruth, does not receive its due, does not honor the notion that truth is not manifest in it as a process.
Plateau.
Yeah. So the schoolboy logic of Hegel's era before he got a hold of a hold of his own conceptions was pretty defunct. Uh, uh, Kyle, go ahead and or Jim, go ahead and read 259.
The dimensions of time, present, future, and past, are the becoming of externality as such, and the resolution of it into the differences of being as passing over into nothing, and of nothing as passing over into being. The immediate vanishing of these differences into singularity is the present as now, which as singularity is exclusive of the other moments, and at the same time completely continuous in them, and is only this vanishing of its being into nothing and of nothing into its being.
Yeah, yeah. This is a logical repetition of the very beginning of the logic, where you see becoming and how it structures what we think of as time. Um, and how far are we? Okay, we're almost done. Um, Hegel says there's no science of time corresponding to the science of space, to geometry. The differences of time have not this indifference of self-externality which constitutes the immediate determinateness of space, and they are consequently not capable of being expressed like space in configurations. So in geometry, you can have several shapes side by side in space, and they relate to each other. This is not what happens in time. The principle of time is only capable of being expressed when the understanding has paralyzed it and reduced its negativity to the unit. This inert one, the uttermost externality of thought, can be used to form external combinations, and these, the numbers of arithmetic, can in turn be brought by the understanding under the categories of equality and inequality of identity and difference. So basically, yeah. So basically, it's a lot harder to see time. It's so much, in its pure negativity. Well, yeah, it's a lot harder to see. Um,
It's kind of like I guess it's the same thing with becoming when it requires both the pat like existence and not coming into and coming out of existence to kind of have a moment where they're both kind of together, and it's kind of like a wave that continues along, even though
yeah.
the past and present in this aspect don't really exist.
Yeah, and he gets down here and he shows us a syllogism that will illuminate those dimensions. So he says, the dimensions of time complete the determinate content of intuition in that they posit for intuition the notions of time which is becoming in its totality or reality. This consists in positing each of the abstract moments of the unity which becoming is as the whole, but under opposite determinations. Each of these two determinations is thus itself a unity of being in nothing, but they are also distinguished. This difference can only be that of coming to be and passing away. In the one case, in the past, being is the foundation, the starting point. The past has been actual as history of the world, as natural events, but posited under the category of non being, which is added to it. In the other case, the position is reversed. In the future, non being is the first determination, while being is later, though, of course, not in time. The middle term is the indifferent unity of both. See the syllogism? So that neither the one nor the other is the determinate. The present is only because the past is not. Conversely, the being of the now is determined as not being, and the non-being of its being is the future. The present is this negative unity. The non-being of the being which is replaced by the now is the past. The being of the non-being which is contained in the present is the future. In the positive meaning of time, it can be said that only the present is, that the positive meaning of that before and after are not. But the concrete present is the result of the past and is pregnant with the future. The true present, therefore, is eternity, movement.
Yep. Also, there's a I think he expounds upon it later. Right now, there's a kind of the tinge of teleology right there.
Well, not even teleology, because I mean, what purpose do these dimensions have except to make up the eternity
Well,
itself?
I'm thinking more of, I guess we talked about at the very end in the addition of motion
Oh,
about rectilinear time and that the goal is actually not in the future, but in the past. And so essentially it is just teleology time through, I guess, its connection with space and place and that stuff becomes the first manifestation of teleology in nature. So that's it's just space time, I guess, at that point.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And he kind of ends by talking about how mathematics deals with these objects only quantitatively. And among them, it does not, as we noted, include time itself, but only the unit variously combined and linked. But applied mathematics is, on the whole, not an immanent science, simply because it is the application of pure mathematics to a given material, matter, and to its empirically derived determinations. It's 9:15, and I'd love to get into place and motion, but I think actually this is a good place to stop, because talking about place and motion, I mean, we talk about it all. We talk about space, we talk about time, and we talk about their unity and how that
Yeah.
unity generates the necessity of matter itself. And um, getting into that is much more logically complicated.
Yeah. Like especially the part where space becomes like time-like and time becomes space-like.
Yeah.
Like they're a unity at this point, but
It's actually not that difficult to understand
I just
how Hegel is making his arguments,
Mhm.
but again, he goes through them step by step to the point where um, you you can almost see it, right? Space and time are logically create um, what place turns out to be. Because you cannot have a place that is very well defined without where it is and when. And that's kind of yeah, that's kind of the point. Uh, just to finish off, it's not only being nothing and becoming that is discussed here in relation to these abstract categories of nature. You'll find also that how we talk about them brings up other categories in consciousness, like here, now, this, right? And how we use those is very much implicated in how we talk about this. Talk about these natural logical categories. And I think it's important to point this out because it's as much our experience as our ability to reason it through that gets you to where you have a good solid determination, a good solid notion, as he calls it, that is informed not just by what we see in front of us and our experience of it, but also our processing of it with our noggins, as we say. So next time we are going to get into place in motion, which we've technically already read, but I'd like us to read further so we can keep going. We've read up through, where have we read up through?
Like in the meeting or outside?
Oh, outside, we've read up to page 44.
Mhm.
So we're up to matter in motion, finite mechanics. So let's see, inert matter, thrust,
Following, yeah.
arc, and falling. Um, how about this? Why don't we, this next week, why don't everybody read from page 44 to 62? That takes us up to C, absolute mechanics. So we'll read all of B, which is finite mechanics. And that'll give us, I don't think we'll make it all the way through that in the next meeting, but at least it'll give us a good, solid basis to look back from to start talking about place in motion and kind of where this is going. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is going well, and I'm going to keep reading Hoolgate up until he's not helpful anymore. But
Yeah.
I'm hoping he gives us a good, solid lead on where we need to go. You know, when his commentary runs out. God, I hope the guy has at least another 20 years in him, because he needs to give us the whole cycle. Okay, I don't think that's going to happen because you know, if I read him right, then the next logical place to go is Hegel on essence, and then Hegel on the notion. And that in itself is going to take quite a while. What do we think, guys? Sounding good?
Turn to go, yeah.
All right. Well, unless you all have anything else, I'll bid you a good night, and I'll see you soon.
I
Like,